All right, so let's get started. Welcome to this joint seminar between the Faculty of Education and Faculty of IT. This is basically the joint venture with the Digital Education Research Group. And we today have a visitor from the University of Edinburgh. It's Yi-Shan Tsai, who is a research associate in the School of Informatics. Although she's an educational researcher by her basic research training with a PhD from the Cambridge University, and she's going to be talking about learning analytics, mostly perspectives of students and teachers. I had a pleasure to work with Yi-Shan for the last 3.5 years. We've been collaborating together on a EU-funded project, which is basically focusing on the ways how we can adopt learning analytics in higher education. We, in that project, managed to connect with a number of different stakeholder groups, starting from senior managers in higher education to students, faculty members, but also all other relevant professional groups and including external experts. Look forward to hearing from Yi-Shan today. Yi-Shan, please.
Well, hi, everyone, and hi to those who join us remotely. Thank you for being here with us instead of taking your coffee break. It's my great pleasure to be here to talk about the perspectives of teachers and students regarding the use of learning analytics in higher education. As Dragan mentioned, that a lot of the data that I'm gonna draw upon in this presentation were collected through a research project called Shira, aiming for supporting higher education to integrate learning analytics. So what I'm planning to cover today includes a little bit introduction to learning analytics, and then I'll then talk about how teachers and students perceive learning analytics. And finally, why learning analytics adoption is a matter of trust. So just before I start, I want to acknowledge the inputs from the whole project team. As you can see, Dragan, some familiar faces, including Dragan and Alex there, and myself. So Dragan was the head of the whole project, and Alex and I like the writing left arms of Dragons. So we had a great team there, which leads to an award that we just recently received as the best project of the year by the Association of Learning Technologies in the UK. So just to give thanks to the start. So what is learning analytics? Well, why don't you tell me? If you have a smart device with you, please either use the QR code or this link there, www.menty.com, and put this code in. You could use one word to describe learning analytics. You can have up to 3 entries. I have heard that there is a learning analytics network here, so it might be good to hear from you what you think about learning analytics, how you would describe learning analytics using one word. So let me switch the screen just to see the answers on this one. And we have already got some answers coming in. Any more? Tracking. Okay. So we've got success, personalization, analysis, evidence, and engagement. Any other different word? Magic. Okay, and perhaps by far the most interesting word I have heard. Metrics. Okay. Right. So it seems that personalization has by far the most popular word that people use to describe learning analytics. Okay, thank you. We'll come back to the okay, that's great. So personalization. very good. That leads quite well to my next few slides. Okay, so what is learning analytics? The most commonly adopted definition is probably this one, which was included in the corporate paper for the first learning analytics conference. It says that learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their context for the purpose of optimizing learning, the whole learning environment. So in a nutshell, learning analytics is about collecting and analyzing data about learning and learners for the purpose of taking an action that could improve learning, be it improving the overall learning environment or teaching the instructions, teaching design, or learning strategy, etc. So I'm gonna shamelessly advertise this short video that I made called Learning Analytics in a Nutshell. You can find this on YouTube. So if you don't have time for me to come, I plan to go on for about an hour long. If you don't have time for this, it's fine. You could just watch this video and you'll know what learning analytics is in 3 minutes. So that's a very basic idea about learning analytics. But more importantly, why are we using learning analytics? What are we trying to achieve with learning analytics? I would say that the current efforts on learning analytics could perhaps be very well summarized in at least 2 areas. The first one is to provide more personalized education. I want to give you some data to put these statements into perspective. I don't know if any of you have come across this report. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a very nice report. So it was published last year by Codman, based on data collected by UNESCO about higher education enrollment in the past few years. And in this report, they made a projection of the growth of higher education by 2040. So what have they found? As you can see in this picture, that there is a steady growth of higher education. Even though overall the enrollment rate is slightly slowing down due to the lower birth rate and smaller youth population, but we can still see that there is a rapid growth of the higher education size in general. And in their estimation, by 2040, we'll have 594.1 million of students in higher education. And we could also look at this by its growth rate since 2000, which is 281% growth. So it really is telling us that higher education is growing very fast, and we are really trying to look for ways to cope with such a big cohort of students coming in. And we could also look at this from the gross enrollment ratio in the second picture, which is about the population of students who are at the age of entering tertiary education to the population of students in this cohort who actually enroll in higher education. So you can see also a growth there. And if we look at students, the enrollment by every 100,000 inhabitants, you could see that by 2040, we expect to have 6,451 students enrolled in higher education per 100,000 inhabitants. So what we are observing here is that, So what we are observing here is that higher education, the model is moving from elite to universal. So in this report, the author maps their observation against the Martin Troll's conceptions of elite, mass, and universal education. His definition is that in the elite system, the prevailing attitude is that access to higher education only belongs to a small group of people who have this privilege at birth or that they are talented. Whereas in a mass higher education system, the access to higher education belongs to a group of people who have certain qualifications. Now, in a universal system, the prevailing attitude is that access to higher education is obligation for people in the middle class and upper class. So what they have found is that currently 60 countries around the world have a universal system, which means that more than 50% of the population corresponds to the age group at tertiary education actually do enroll in tertiary education. And normally this cohort of students are aged between age 18 and 23. And if we look at selected countries that have this universal system, you can see that Australia is by far the highest in terms of the gross enrollment ratio. So there is a gap of missing data, so as the USA. We don't know what happened, why, but we can see that USA started with the highest GER compared to the others, and we can see that there is a steady growth for some of the countries, especially sharp growth for countries like China and Chile. And it is possible to have this ratio over 100 because UNESCO also considered some younger and older populations who either have started their education earlier or later, or maybe they received their grade, or maybe they just move faster than some of their peers. So it's quite impressive that in Australia the ratio is really high. So massive education or universal education is something that we are facing today, and perhaps Australia even more so. And in the UK, as if you have noticed earlier, that the growth is a bit flat now, but still you can see that the population of students is very high. So what we are observing here is that educational provision is scaling. And perhaps the online education is scaling too, perhaps not perhaps, but we are seeing it scaling, and it's just a mechanism that we are using to try to cope with such a massive population of students. But has our dialogue with students scaled too? And have we, or is it possible at all to scale education while providing personalized support to students? Is it possible at all to meet the needs of such a diverse student population? And how can we address this challenge using technological innovation? Is a question that has been frequently asked and that has turned our attention to learning analytics. So, number one, try to personalize education using learning analytics, something that we are really interested in doing. Now, the second area is to make better decisions. Why we are using learning analytics really is to inform our decisions, to really make better data-informed decisions in the educational environment, educational setting. So for senior managers, learning analytics provide information about learners that might help them better manage the academic enterprise. So for example, managing the enrollment and also managing student retention and better allocate resources. However, this alone is nothing more than academic services, academic analytics. In fact, from my conversation with several senior managers, I noticed that some of them didn't really distinguish academic analytics from learning analytics. To them, learning analytics is nothing more than this, but it's not. Learning analytics is about how we can enhance learning, as you have seen earlier in this, the most commonly adopted definition that learning analytics is about optimizing learning. It's not just about managing higher education institution. So for teachers, what we are looking for is to provide them timely information that can help them adjust their teaching design and their learning support for students. So for example, if teacher sees that certain particular students have been disengaged for a long period of time, maybe they would like to nudge them, maybe they would like to initiate the conversation with them. Or if they have seen a lot of revisits to a particular segment of a video lecture, maybe they want to see if this is a concept that perhaps is particularly difficult for students, and maybe whether there is a need to provide additional supplementary materials for students or not. Yeah. Or perhaps for a certain week, they notice that students demonstrate more catch-up behavior or just less engaged. Then maybe as an instructor, that you might want to know whether there's something happening during that week, if it's inevitable, avoidable. Should we maybe provide something lighter for students? So that's just some information to help students or help teachers get a better view of what's happening to the whole cohort of students. Now for students, we're hoping that by providing more timely information, feedback to students, that will help them to have a better grasp of how they themselves are progressing and how compared to the whole cohort or compared to the set targets, how far they are with their own goals, and whether there's a need to adjust the goals or their learning strategies. So for example, if they continue to receive some red lights about their engagement or performance, maybe they would think about seeking support from peers or from teachers. So it really is about giving data back to students to help them to manage their own learning. I want to highlight this paper. Let's not forget learning analytics are about learning by Dragon and the others. That in this paper, they have argued that just by using the common indicators about student attributes or behavior, it's not enough. It doesn't translate data into actionable recommendations if we don't take into account pedagogical intents or what is happening inside the learners, those internal conditions, what makes learners make this decision, what they are going through emotionally, and what kinds of learning strategies they decide to adopt, etc. So we can't really move far without considering these. And so learning analytics is not just about supporting decision at managerial levels. It's really about supporting decisions, helping us making better decisions at both learning and teaching levels. But then we need to ask a question, very important question, which is how far have we gone with learning analytics? The answer is not very far, unfortunately. A little bit sad, but this paper published last year, a systematic literature review by Beibel and the others, they reviewed 252 papers on learning analytics in higher education. They define scalability condition by whether a tool has been implemented and with involvement of teachers or students. So they have defined this condition with whether there is involvement of these key stakeholders. And what they have found is that 94% of the papers that they expected could not scale. And also this phenomenon has not changed really or increased at all over the years. So what is the problem? The literature has shown that there are three areas of prominent challenges associated with learning analytics. The first one is the demand on resources, which include financial resource, technological resource, and human resources. And the second area is about issues around ethics and privacy. And the third one is about stakeholder engagement and buy-in. In many ways, these areas of challenges interrelate with each other. So, for example, without the buy-in from senior managers, it's very hard to get sufficient resources to implement learning analytics. Similarly, if we can't address issues of ethics and privacy, it's quite difficult to get teachers and students on board to use learning analytics. But on the positive side, what do teachers and students think about learning analytics? We observed quite strong interest in using learning analytics to improve teaching on 3 levels. At student level, teachers are hoping that learning analytics could help students develop their self-regulated learning skills. By giving data back to them, they would have a better idea of where they are, and hopefully this kind of data could also help students from getting unnecessarily anxious or too optimistic about how they perform, and therefore stop trying harder. In terms of teaching level, the teachers are also quite interested in using learning analytics to better identify the areas where students struggle, the areas where they could provide further support. Yeah, and also to know how well students engage with learning content, especially whether students use the learning materials that they have created at home, perhaps what preference students have towards those different learning materials. At program level, I think program is called course in Australian context. But at the program level, especially for teaching staff who have the director role, program director role, are particularly interested in knowing overall how well the program is performing, the strengths and the weakness, how they could further improve the educational provision. So that's the interest among teaching staff that we have observed. From students, we noticed that they were very interested in getting more personalized support, which is of course then related to the other areas of support that they decided. For example, better feedback, more constructive feedback, and more tailored resources to suit the needs of individuals, and also better teaching quality. So for example, the student here is talking about universities widening access, but they don't seem to catch up at the course level in terms of really providing education to meet students who come from different learning backgrounds. And then this one, the student is talking about the transition from high school to higher education, where the contact with instructors is so much less. So the student is talking about using learning analytics to get more feedbacks to help them just have a better idea in general about how well they are performing, given that they are not receiving so much feedback from the teacher like when they were in secondary school. And for students who have learning difficulties or disabilities, to them, just to find the right resource, the right support resource is challenging. So for these students, we have heard that they would appreciate if learning analytics could maybe get resources in a better way that saves them the effort or time to just filter through so many emails that they receive every day. And this is another example from a student who speaks English as a second language, that learning analytics could just show them that, hey, here's something you could try. Then they think it will be great. Students also mentioned that if teachers could reflect on the patterns of their performers, then and then adjust their teaching, perhaps providing better support, then they would appreciate that too. So for example, this is from a group of grad school students. They were talking about the concept of inflammation, which they constantly perform badly at exams. So they were just saying that how come over the years the teacher never did anything to address this? And I guess from teachers' perspective, this might be something they expect. There are certain concepts we know students particularly struggle with, so we might be prepared for that. But for students, it's their grades, so every point counts. So they were just wondering why teachers didn't do anything. And therefore they would say that, well, if learning analytics could give teachers some information about this and then adjust so that they could adjust their teaching, that would be great. And there's this other comment from the student is think back to the personalized support, that if teachers could use, students could know better about students' prior educational background or learning experience, then perhaps teaching would be done in a better way that doesn't leave anyone behind. So that's what the students was talking about. And from the survey that we distributed among students, it reached out to 6 institutions, about 3,000 students. So the survey was designed by Alex there. So this survey has 12 items falling into 2 categories. One category is about students' expectations of learning analytics related services. And the other category is about their expectations of ethics and privacy in terms of using learning analytics. So we can see from the 2 graphs here that students have very high interest in using learning analytics to improve their self-regulated skills. So we have 2 graphs here. The left one is about the ideal expectations of what could happen. So ideally, they want these to happen. And the right graph shows, in reality, what they expect to see. So the last 3 items are about receiving complete profile of their learning and making their own decisions based on learning analytics by knowing how they progress compared to a set learning goal. So we can see that these 3 items receive high average scores. But we also noticed that from our Open University in the Netherlands sample, the students didn't particularly have high expectations towards receiving complete profile about themselves. We don't know why this question doesn't offer them an option to explain. But what it's telling us is that, well, perhaps in different contexts, students just have different needs. What we do know is that the Open University students are generally more mature age. The age distribution is towards old mature ages. So perhaps to them, they think they know about themselves, they know about their learning well enough, they don't need teachers to keep telling them every 2 weeks or every week, perhaps. So that's our interpretation, one of the interpretations, but what we do know is that students in different contexts do have different needs. So that's down to institutions to find out what their students need. On the negative side, we have heard a lot about concerns around ethics and privacy, and also whether learning analytics can really close the feedback loop effectively. Right, so we have heard about those positive sides. You read for the negative side. There's quite a lot. Okay. So from students, we asked them to tell us what kinds of data practices would be legitimate in their view. 4 themes emerged as criteria for them to assess whether the university is using their data ethically or not. Purpose, access, anonymity, and security. In terms of purpose, we found that students were, in general, quite happy for the institution to use their data to comply legal requirements. So for example, in the UK, we have to track students. Not a very good word, but that's what we do in reality, track where students are, whether they are still studying or not. So that's for the visa requirements. They're also happy for the university to use their data to improve the educational services in general. And they are also very happy for the university to use their data to improve the overall performance of the institution. So for example, the league ranking, equity of the education, the recruitment of future students. So even though the benefits may not be the direct beneficiaries, but students were still happy for the institution to use their data for all these purposes listed here. Now, access and anonymity are like 2 sides of a coin. A few issues came up related to access and anonymity. The first one is surveillance. In general, students averse to any kind of data collection that is intensive enough to make them feel that they are being watched, like under a microscope. And stereotypes is another thing that has been mentioned a lot as well. Students have the fear that by making data available to tutors or some instructors, it could produce certain stereotypes about themselves. And that might then unfairly affect how the instructors treat these students or mark them. So that's a prevailing concern we have heard from students. And there is quite a lot of distrust in third parties in terms of university sharing data with third parties or outsourcing certain services, for example, analysis, etc. And the fear comes from not knowing what will happen to the data after it travels out of the university, and also the existing experience of receiving commercialized emails. So that's the main fear about sharing data with third party. Also from the student survey, in this category of items about ethics and privacy, we noticed that students have very high expectations. So you can see the scores are very high, at least more than 5.5 here, in terms of the ideal expectations regarding how the universities would treat their data ethically and securely. And predicted expectations are slightly lower, but you can see that's still quite high. So we could see that this item about keeping their data securely receives the highest scores. But what is also interesting to us is that for the university to seek students' consent before collecting and analyzing using their educational data to improve educational services is comparatively lower than the others. And in fact, for our Spanish sample here, we could see that it's almost close to indifference. So what is that telling us is that perhaps students are already used to the university collecting and using their educational data to provide educational services. Perhaps to them, that's just what the university has to do. Or perhaps they do agree with that the students and the university need to work in partnership, that university should use their data, and they probably don't even need to ask them because that's their responsibility to use data to provide better services. So that's what we have heard from students through the survey. But despite this clear stance about how the university should use their data and this sort of protective attitudes toward their data, we also observed a very interesting phenomenon called privacy paradox, which is a prevailing phenomenon around in consumer behavior. So I think many of us here would be able to relate to this. This is something that we do, if not daily, then at least monthly, I would say, that we often take. Yes, I agree. I have read the terms and conditions, and I'm happy for you to use my data. But whilst in fact, in reality, we probably didn't even bother to click that link, or maybe we did, but the terms and conditions were just so unfriendly, or the interface was just messed up, especially on mobile phone. It's very strange. How come they don't even consider mobile users? But this happened to me a lot, that I actually tried to read, but it was just not readable on the mobile phone. So this happens to us a lot, that we agree to it anyway if we want to use a certain service. So we observe this among students too, even though they have a very strong attitude toward how their data should be used. So we could attribute this phenomenon to, we could identify three possible factors that have contributed to this phenomenon. The first one is that perceived benefits outweigh perceived risks. And as the student indicates here, that she sees the benefit of sharing her data with her tutor, so she's happy to do that. And the second factor is power imbalance. So this especially happens when giving consent to have your data being used is just part of the enrollment procedure. Of course, this is changing, given that there's a new European data protection law that have been put into force. Universities are changing their way of dealing with student data. students are given more control over their data. But still, in terms of asking student consent at enrollment, that perhaps depends on how universities interpret the collection and use of student data, whether it is legitimate, a legitimate purpose, whether it meets the public interest or not, because that's indicated by this European law that it's okay to use personal data if it's for these reasons. So it's for the institution to then interpret what is legitimate, what is of the public interest. So this could continue as long as it's part of the enrollment procedure. Students just see it as part of the things that they need to finish. So this is, in a way, this is encouraging passive engagement. Students are not paying so much attention to what is written in the document. In fact, among all the 26 students I spoke, I think only one student said that he didn't read what the paper, the policy was about, the terms and conditions. So that's another thing. And the third factor is that trust exacerbates information asymmetry. So we did observe very good trust among students in the institution. There's a word that has been used a lot by the students. When I ask them about whether they know what the university is doing with their data, they use assume. They say that, yes, we assume that the university has documents that explain what they're doing with our data. And if I want to look for it, I can find it. I assume I did tick the box when I entered the university, when I agreed to, and to become a student here. So we saw that students in general were taking a cure approach rather than a prevention approach to protecting their data. And that's the distrust is another factor that is contributing to this privacy phenomenon. Okay, so that's some concerns related to ethics and privacy. We have also heard concerns about whether learning analytics can close the feedback loop effectively or not. And I'm going to use this early framework proposed by Dr. in 2012 just to explain how those concerns are related to learners' data metrics and interventions. In terms of data, we have heard a lot, both from students and teachers, whether data can really capture the differences among different students. And here is an example from the teacher saying that she doesn't want her students to just become mini her. She didn't want them to behave in a way that satisfies the algorithm. And the same argument has been used on turning it in. I don't know if people use turning it in here. So there are also some arguments about that. Whether we are just turning students into certain types of students. And in terms of metrics, there are also concerns about whether learning is interpreted precisely. So there is this concern that learning is a very difficult concept to grasp and to even observe. And it varies so much by individuals, let alone disciplines. So that's something that people are finding it difficult to use metrics to define learning. So here is a feedback from teacher that we need to be very careful about drawing causal relationship between behavior and performance with learning. And that's also something that has been highlighted in the paper that I mentioned earlier, that's not learning analytics about learning. In terms of interventions, there are a few things that have been mentioned by teachers especially, and students as well. So for example, the first one is equity. In what way we are using learning analytics that is promoting equity rather than sacrificing equity. So here we hear from students that they would like learning analytics they would like the institution and teachers to make use of their background data to tailor support for them, but they do not want such support and services to be only targeted at certain students for the fear of being labeled. Right, so they want it to be made available to everyone. They want the design to be informed by students' backgrounds, but they don't want the service to be made available only to those particular groups of students. And then for teachers, there's also this question about whether it is right to single out a group of students to provide them special support. There are also some opinions regarding agency, to what extent we are giving students a choice to make their own decisions. So let's hear what this teacher said. So this teacher is saying that we are trying to spoon feed students, and then by telling them that, oh, you are not engaging, you are not following, maybe you should do this, maybe you should do that. So there are some conflicting views here, even though students do appreciate some data like navigation of results, tell them that what could help them. But then teachers here are worried that are we spoon feeding students? And often it has been a way the university respond to those poor satisfaction scores, especially from students, National Student Survey, and some poor teaching schools. So in UK we have this teaching excellence framework. So these have all been used as common indicators of teaching excellence. So that's really putting pressure on teachers. So there's this worry whether we are actually taking the agency away from students or not. And for students, though, they say that, well, yes, we are adults, but still we would appreciate some guidance. So we can see some conflicting views here. The question is, when is the right point for us to intervene, and how? In what way that will make both sides of stakeholders happy? And of course, capacity is something that has been frequently mentioned by teachers, that they simply do not have any more capacity for taking on more work. So that's an interesting thing that we have heard across all the staff groups. So they're saying that we are offering high quality of industrial scale education, and yet we are promising students that you are all being looked after by teaching staff. But in reality, teaching staff don't actually have time. So, sorry, so this is actually by a teacher, not by students. It's feedback. And then of course, there's also some feedback about how learning analytics might have any adverse negative impact on learners, for example, demotivating them, how they would interpret the feedback, whether that would actually just make them feel content that they're okay and they don't need to try harder, or make them feel even worse, and how we communicate a message, and how do we know how they would interpret the message. So that's another thing. And then of course, this is also an interesting one that a few teachers have mentioned that actually some students just don't care. Whatever you give them, we have already given them a lot. So now you are telling us to give them more, but they are just not responding. So some of so like that's why you can sense this teacher's frustration. That it's like speaking into a black hole sometimes. You're not just gonna hear anything back. So I think from all the observations that I've shared with you, we could perhaps land on this statement that learning analytics adoption is a matter of trust. From what we have heard, we could see that sadly, teaching staff did not demonstrate very good trust in the institution. So we have heard a lot from them that learning analytics, instead of saving them time, instead of helping them with their teaching efficiency, which is actually how some senior managers would see that. But sadly, to teaching staff, it's not. It's just extra workload to them. And that learning analytics might be used as a managerial tool to monitor them or to pass their judgment. So for example, this teacher made it very clear that I don't trust the institution. But what is interesting here is that the teacher said this is not a critique of the technology, but the implementation of this is crucial. So I think that's a very important point for us to remember, that technology itself does not do the magic. So that magic came up earlier in this workshop. That's an interesting one. Technology itself does not do the magic. It's about the implementation that brings about the changes that we want to see. And in terms of learning analytics and algorithms, we see that there is reasonable doubt regarding how well learning analytics can present and capture learning, and how well it aligns with disciplinary pedagogies, and also to what extent it is interpretable. So here, this teacher is talking about algorithms being clever and opaque, and so they didn't know what's happening behind the data, and that's making it difficult to trust in the results that they give back, the feedback that they receive through learning analytics. Towards students, teachers also are not quite sure how students would respond, whether they have the ability to interpret data and to interpret it in a constructive way to take positive actions. In terms of students, they share reasonable doubts, similar doubts as teachers regarding whether learning analytics can, to what extent it can capture and represent learning. They also demonstrate distrust, particularly towards commercial third parties, for the fear of becoming commercial targets. But in general, they have good trust in the institution, and they have high expectation for teaching staff to deliver more personalized support. So for us to move forwards, I think there are three questions that we perhaps want to think about. How we can leverage student trust in the adoption of learning analytics, and how can we address the information asymmetry as a result of trust and indifference. So despite that student trust in the institution in general, in how they use their data, but without further engagement, it can be difficult for us to expect students to use learning analytics in a constructive way that we expect them to really be able to move from data to action without further understanding of what the university is doing or what learning analytics can do for them. And also, how can we gain trust or regain trust on teachers? That's perhaps something we want to think about. So I would like to share some implications for learning analytics strategy. The first one I want to highlight is to have a sound policy and effective communications to really make sure that members in the institution are clear about the purpose of using learning analytics, and also the transparent process regarding how data will be collected and used. The second one is to increase the observability and trialability of learning analytics to attract buy-in. So really just give key stakeholders an opportunity to try on learning analytics so that they have the chance to know what it is, what learning analytics can do or cannot do, and give them a chance to critique it and to bring their opinions on board so that we can work together to see how we can work out a way that meets people's needs. And install data literacy and reflective skills among key stakeholders. So this is very important in terms of how these key users will interpret data in a constructive way and moving on to actions. And also incorporate the views of different stakeholders to develop common vision and sense of ownership using a dialogic approach. And clarify the value of learning analytics with these limitations. We know that learning analytics is not silver bullet. There are things they can do, things that cannot do. So what are they? This is very important in managing expectations. So in terms of developing trustful learning analytics, what we have done through the project is we developed a policy framework called SHILA framework. It's now a web tool, and you can access it through this link. So what we try to do is take decision makers and policy makers step by step to consider the uniqueness of and the needs, the drivers for learning analytics in their institutional context, and to consider the needs of different stakeholders, and also think about what kinds of changes they want to see rather than just what they want to do with learning analytics, but really what changes do they want to see. And based on that, devise the clear steps to work towards these changes, and also do not forget to think about whether they have the capacity at all or not, and they need to scale up their capacity in any way to drive towards the changes, and then to monitor the whole process and continue learning from the experience. So in this framework, we have a collection of key action points that we have observed from 51 higher education institutions in Europe, and some of the key challenges that different stakeholders face, and some questions that we encourage people to answer when they are developing the policy for learning analytics. So this is just to show you the interface of the web tool. You will be able to drag these statements and create your own statements. And I just want to show you an example of what we did at the University of Edinburgh. Learning analytics principles and purposes were developed when Jordan was still with us. He was the commander of learning of a policy task group. So we started with some principles, and then we moved on to develop a detailed set of policies. And that, in a way, is for us to nurture this trusted relationship with key users. So there are 7 principles, and I highlighted 4 of them here. And you will be able to see that they speak back to some of the concerns that I highlighted earlier. So the first one, as an institution, we understand that data never provides a whole picture about students' capacities or likelihood of success. The second one, we recognize that data and algorithms can contain and perpetuate bias. And third one, data generated from learning analytics will not be used to monitor the staff performance. And the fourth one, we do not propose the deficit model targeted only at supporting students at failure. So you can see that these speak to some of the concerns I mentioned earlier. I would like to end my talk at this slide, and I don't know if there is time at all to give the ground back to everyone here and those who join us from Zoom to perhaps have some exchange of our ideas regarding how we can move forward.
We may have time for a couple of questions.
We have about 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
Yeah, 4 minutes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thanks very much, Yi-Shan.